practice the techniques that you would do? And the answer, one of the major influences on my spiritual practice was Michelle. I started reading her books while I was on death row, and I'd fallen in love with ceremonial magic when I was 10 or 12 years old, but it was always of a more ceremonial bent, you know, really complicated and technical, and that's sort of the approach that I always went with. And then when I discovered Michelle's work, she described things, explained things in a way where she stripped all of the unnecessary technical stuff away from it and made it where it's what I like to refer to as the empty hand technique, where you don't need anything to practice the techniques that she teaches. You don't need candles, you don't need incense, you don't need, you know, wands or robes or any of that. Those things are all nice and fun and great to wear in your spare time, but you don't need any of those things. And I knew that on a theoretical level, but I didn't know how to do it technically until I came into contact with Michelle's work. So her work has had a huge influence on my life. So I'm really happy and really proud to be able to be here with her tonight doing this. So we're going to talk about, for those who haven't seen it yet, Michelle will be signing her book by the door. It's called Conspiracy of Angels. She's actually the author of over 24 books, but they've all been, up until now, nonfiction. You know, they've always been meditation, they've always been energy work, they've always been psychic development, all of these sorts of things. This is her first novel. And so I was going to ask Michelle, the first question I would have is, what made you transfer from nonfiction to fiction?
There are a number of fiction writers who have sourced a lot of my nonfiction. I mean, like the Dictionary of Demons and the magic and the energy work are really great for world building, especially in urban fantasy. And one of the things that I've seen with the way their stories inspire people who might not normally come to magic from a practical or experiential side, is, you know, they create these mythic landscapes that are not only inspiring, but teach certain key ideas that for people for whom it resonates, you know, it lights a spark and makes them want to learn more about those deeper realities around us. And at the same time, tells a great story. I'm a huge fan of the works of Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, the archetypes that speak to us, the stories that weave our world. And, you know, there's a certain point where telling a story is the best way to pass along certain truths about the world we live in, about who we are. I worked for 5 seasons, which is give or take more than 5 years, on a television show called Paranormal State, where my job was to walk into haunted places, like severely scary haunted places, blindfolded, with all of my shields down, and pick up whatever I could pick up. And some of working on Conspiracy of Angels, building the world of the shadow side, was also learning to contextualize, to put into perspective some of the experiences that I had there that I couldn't really just casually talk about. Partly because of NDAs, and partly because some of it was so unhooked, so completely off the wall, that there's no way to have a conversation about some of those experiences.
We've talked over the past few days about how some of our favorite authors, that, you know, books we've read together, things like the Jim Butcher series. He writes a series of books, fictional books, about this wizard in Chicago named Harry Dresden. But the way he writes about him, it's a fictional story, and it's really entertaining. It catches your attention. It's like adventure stories, but at the same time, he explains magic in a way that is very, very real. You know, it's very, very close to the way we actually do practice ritual ceremonial magic in the modern world. And that's one of the things that also makes it so good. He's able to teach things, almost like using these stories that hold your attention as a vehicle to express ideas about what magic really is, to sort of get rid of some of the false ideas we have about it and teach people what it actually is. And Michelle does some of that same thing in Conspiracy of Angels. How did you go about developing the system of magic in Conspiracy of Angels?
Well, first I started with the idea of the shadow side, and that is absolutely from the experiences that I was having on Paranormal State, which when I do a psychic reading, and I'm going to use air quotes for that because I kind of hate the word psychic. because it builds up this expectation of, I don't know, Lady Circe on the street corner, and, you know, the people who are charlatans and shysters, and, you know, the John Edwards of the world, and the people who fall somewhere in between and don't necessarily understand it beyond these things that flicker around. We've got a lot of misunderstandings that go along with that word. When I walk blindfolded into a location, it became very apparent to me that there was this whole, like, almost holographic layer of perception that I have. And it's part of my daily perception, like, all the time. But blocking out at least one layer of physical perception helped me to concentrate on it. And it really would feel like the deeper I got into that, the more it felt like I was almost crossing into this realm of spirits and echoes, memories, not always even intelligent hauntings, but just like the fingerprints that people leave behind in spaces. The empty echoes of lives that are built up, especially in older residences or in places where, like, trauma has happened. And these layers, these images would just sort of like shuffle on top of one another. And in sketching out how I was experiencing that, I was like, well, damn, this reads like it. I'm a huge Jim Butcher fan. And there's a number of other people who I really like, but Butcher is one of the ones who really, for me, he's someone who does know how magic works. It's really obvious that he does. He's got, like, the best description of what a pentacle actually means, even outside of, like, all of the pagan books that a couple of my pagan friends write. Like, when I'm teaching anything about that, I'm like, I have to quote him, and I'm like, yes, it comes from fiction. This guy knows what he's talking about. So in putting that together, I realized the best way to convey it would be to kind of put readers into that world, to show what it's like to you know, sometimes just lay your hand against something and suddenly have this wash of impressions, and traipse that line. I'm also a Lovecraft fan, and one of the reasons I really like urban fantasy as a genre is, you know, that verisimilitude. There's a lot of focus on drawing from the real world and selling the more fantastical elements by really traipsing the line and even blurring it at times, and teaching people and giving them a rollicking good tale at the same time of how things really work, what it feels like to be in a world like that.
Another one of the things we've talked about is how magic and art are so intertwined that it's almost like they're twin sisters. You know, both of them are means of creating the reality that we want to live in. You know, I always say that art should be like an initiation process. It should be something that, you know, it was never meant to be something that you bought because it matched your living room furniture. Art was meant to be supposed to be something that changes you in some sort of way. You know, you're not supposed to be the same person when you walk away from a piece of art that you were when you approached it. If you're completely the same, then in some way the artist has failed. You know, it's meant to transform you as a person in some way or another. And Michelle, whenever she writes, always approaches writing as, you know, even though it's an art, she approaches it as an act of magic. Sort of like Grant Morrison does, if you've ever read his books, The Invisibles. He talks about, he started realizing he could create the reality he wanted to create. So he started writing the stories into his graphic novels that he wanted to experience, that he wanted to come about, that he wanted to sort of inject into the collective unconscious, into the human psyche. So when you're going about the process of writing, turning this artwork into ritual, did you ever have anything weird or anything?
The weirdest one that you can probably find this person on Twitter, and they will back me up on it. I do a lot of dreamwalking work as well, outside of the fictional stuff, although you will have encountered dreamwalking in fiction thanks to Neil Gaiman, to whom my dreamwalking book was dedicated. It's in his Graveyard book. So dreamwalking, simply put, is where out-of-body experience and lucid dreaming combine, and it's a way to reach out and communicate with people. So I do a lot of shared dream work, and so it's not unusual for people in my friends' network and my network of students to reach back and like to record dreams that they have. Take note if they think that I've reached out to them, and we will usually keep like dream journals so we can compare whether or not stuff's happening. So that said, my friend Chris, who I had worked with on Paranormal State, starts texting me about this dream he was having, and he thought it was a dream walking thing. And he's describing, it sort of felt like a film noir. There's this very buxom redhead. She's got a really, harsh personality, but very, very flirtatious. She's kind of like a Jessica Rabbit, but also, if Jessica Rabbit were an assassin in a film noir thing. She's describing this tall, lanky guy with this sort of shock of hair. He's wearing a leather jacket. And she's like, and I keep dreaming about these people. And at the time, I'm working on Conspiracy of Angels. And I realize, I'm like, you're not having a dream of anything connected to any magical stuff that I'm doing technically. You are dreaming scenes out of my book that I've told nobody about. And the main characters that kept running around in Chris's head were Lil, who you will meet tonight, and Zach, who is the main character. And Chris has pretty consistently had dreams at this point. If I am really deep in the writing, Chris will be like, really? Again? When are you going to be done with the series? I'm like, I've got 12 books planned. I'm really sorry. That's definitely one of the weirder, but also kind of fun weird ones. Like fun validation for the fact that I really am sort of putting stuff out into the world. I love Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. When it comes to creativity, it vexes me sometimes, because once you start to understand like the flow that happens between you and this vast, roiling, primordial ocean of archetype and mythic imagination that we all share, the more you start to recognize that like sometimes, every creative person is ladling something up out of there, and similar ideas will come up independent of one another. And you'll find like 4 or 5 people all at the same time. It's just like the time of this particular concept bubbling up from the depths. And it's neat when you see sort of like these trends within ideas, and it's not that anybody's stealing anything from anybody else, it's just it's time for that version of the story to be told. And it's so neat to watch that process and to realize that we are all connected on the same level that flocks of birds are connected, or schools of fish, but usually our very rational, present, detail-oriented brain doesn't realize that, doesn't pay attention to it. It's all happening on the peripheral vision.
Lori and I both have been really interested in angels for years. It's seems like one of the easiest forms of energy work to do, just because there's something sort of ingrained in us that you trust angels. You don't have, any weird misgivings or anything else, just because we've been raised from a really early age to think of them as these benevolent intelligences, almost as like babysitters with wings in some situations, some cases. But when you really start looking into angel lore, the history and mythology of angels in all these different cultures, you realize that's not always entirely true. Some of these things are fucking horrible. Anytime when you're reading the Bible, for example, every single time an angel appears to someone, the first thing it always says every time is "Be not afraid." So it must be scaring the shit out of them. There's something about it that they find terrifying in some way. That lets you know right there, it's not this always appearing as this benevolent creature that looks like a glowing human being with wings. They can be horrific things. When you were writing this book, when you're bringing all the angel lore into this, what different sources did you go to? What mythologies did you go to in order to bring those characteristics into these stories?
I've had a long-standing fascination and interest, as well as research, with angel and angel lore. Part of that is a love of the poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke, who has a line that will stick with you: every angel is terrifying. My last name, Belanger, it's beautiful angel. So there's this theme that's woven through some of my family's inspiration, my family's history, that inspired me to go digging around. There's the Book of Enoch, which is an apocryphal text. It's a fancy word for saying there's a number of things that were at one point part of biblical tradition, and at various points throughout the development of the canonical Bible were either included or excluded. If you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch, and particularly the Book of the Watchers, that talks about 200 angels that stepped out of heaven and came on down to earth, not exactly fallen, and intermarried with daughters of men. You find fragments of this story throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls and fragments of stuff related to that story. The Midrash of Shem-Hazai and Azazel, or Azael, depending on how they're pronouncing it or spelling it, because the spelling will vary from thing to thing, and that is in the Chronicles of Jeremiel, collected by the Rabbi Moses Gaster. And then there are related Midrashes. I dug as deep as I could. The Christians got their angelology and demonology from the Jews. The Jews got a lot of their angelology and demonology from the Babylonians, who got theirs from the Sumerian. And it is something that it's a myth and an archetype and an idea that curls at the center of Western civilization in our idea of gods, goddesses, and beings. The Babylonian and Sumerian material, there's a prayer that we will encounter now. Michael at my right hand, Raphael. It's an invocation of the 4 archangels. And a flashpoint for me was when I had dug through. The University of Pennsylvania had done an investigation, an archaeological dig, at the Library of Ashurbanipal at the tail end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. Among other things, they brought back like the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, things that are familiar. But there were a whole lot of fragmented texts that some enterprising grad student eventually decided to translate because nobody wanted to touch them. They were all the weird stuff. They were exorcisms. They were spells. They were things that traced the line between medicine and magic. And one of these has exactly that invocation of the 4 archangels, word for word, except it is Sumerian deities, Marduk and Shamash, and they are all the same positions. And Shamash is a particularly interesting fellow because he's a god back then. If you read the book of Enoch, Shamsiel is the angel of the sun. Shamash is a god of the sun. And so you can see this line of descent among what were once gods and goddesses and then got adopted into a system that eventually became monotheistic. And having talked with other scholars, because I'm an escapee of academia, there's really compelling evidence that the angels that we know were originally the pantheon of gods and goddesses that predate Jewish monotheism. And you can see that in a lot of the names. The Book of Enoch is fascinating because it ascribes qualities to each of them. Sauriel is the angel of the moon. Shamsiel is the angel of the sun. And the whole idea of the flood story, according to the Book of Enoch, the flood comes about because these otherworldly beings have intermarried with the daughters of men and brought a spark of heaven, brought this knowledge that is above and beyond what humans were allowed, and integrated it here on Earth, created this vast and sometimes far too ambitious for its own good empire, taught divination, but not only magic, metallurgy, cosmetics, divination. In addition to that, there's actually, in the Book of Enoch, there's an angel basically of abortion, Kasdeha, teaches the stillings of the infant in the womb. So all of this information that was thought to be forbidden, information that was too much for people to handle, and it was that information, according to the Book of Enoch, that starts the flood. Because a cry goes up to heaven, and everybody goes off to Enoch and says, "Hey, God really likes you. Could you, go maybe say a few things, get this sorted out?"
I always think it's more fun whenever you do something like this if it's interactive. So I know it can be scary to speak out in front of a bunch of people, but we're doing it so you can too. What we would like to do is open it up to questions and answers. Make it not just a sermon where you're here listening to us talk, but an actual dialogue, a back and forth. So anything that you want to talk about, whether it's the new book, whether it's Michelle's experiences with Paranormal State, whether it's what ceremonial magic techniques I was doing when I was in prison, whatever it is that you want to talk about, that's basically what we're here for.
If I just wanted to stand up here and talk and a whole bunch of quiet people, I'd have stayed in academia.
So is there anybody that wants to start? Yes.
Okay. You first, and then we'll get the down. Oh, you first.
Okay. Damien, on Facebook, you had wrote a quote about everybody being haunted by something. It was a great. I shared it with friends of mine. And now you also just touched on that. And I'd like to know more about it. Yes. I can really relate to that, but I want to hear
I guess, for me, I started really thinking about that a lot when I was in prison and you have everything stripped away from you. When we're out here in the world, we, for some reason, being in a place like that, being in complete and absolute seclusion, isolation, it really, really increases your sense of nostalgia because you're not creating any real new memories, at least none that you want to have, none you want to cherish, none you want to hold close. So you find yourself returning over and over and over to things from the past. It could be the way your Christmas tree looked when you were 10 years old, or anything. And you find yourself returning to those things over and over and over because it's the only trace of your humanity you have left. It's the only thing you have left that's not part of this brutal, horrendous hell that you find yourself living in. And those things for me were the means that I had whenever I started doing things. And this is one of those words that I hate just because it conjures all these flaky New Age images in your head. But whenever you're talking about things like astral projection, those were the places. For me, it wasn't about necessarily going to a different place. It was about going to a different time. Going to a time when things were more simple, when things were less painful, when I was happier, when I had some sort of interaction with the world around me in some sort of way. So there were entire blocks of time that would extend for years at a time when, for all intents and purposes, I lived my life as a ghost, when I was just haunting my own past over and over. And I think some element of me has been doing that my entire life. When I wrote about this in Life After Death, if you've read that book. When I was in kindergarten, I went out to play one night. My mom told me, of course, do not leave the front of this apartment complex where we live. She said, do not go anywhere. Stay right here in front. So as soon as she turned her back, of course, I ran off. I ran around to where was this huge pile of dirt. When I was a kid, I thought digging holes was the greatest thing in the world. That was like the epitome of fun to me, digging holes. And my dad used to tell me, stop or you're going to make someone break their neck. They're going to trip in it. But of course, I ran away and started digging holes and didn't even realize how late it was getting until I looked around and it was completely dark. And I started going back home, started walking home, and I passed a guy, and I can't even remember exactly what he said to me now. I just remember seeing this guy in the doorway, and he's wearing a pair of black pants, and he didn't have a shirt on, and he had shoulder-length hair, and he's standing there in this doorway, and he tells me, your mom's looking for you, you better go on home, because she's going to beat your ass when she catches you. So I didn't think anything about it. I went home, and of course my mom beat my ass. I didn't think of this again until I was probably a decade later, 10 years later, right before I was getting ready to be arrested. I was getting ready to trim my hair one day, and I had my shirt off, and I walked into the bathroom, and I realized when I looked in the mirror, I was the guy that I had seen that night when I was really young. So I've always had really bizarre things like that happen my entire life. And that was what I was thinking about whenever I wrote that. All of us in some way or another, we have things that we return to, that we cling to, some things we don't want to return to, that we can't get away from, that have scarred us in some sort of way. But for me, that's what it was about. It's how almost my entire life, in one way or another, I've lived as a ghost.
In the paranormal, there's a general idea that ghosts haunt because of unfinished business. And while that can be kind of a trite concept, I've spent a great deal of time studying the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So their whole idea of the process of death and dying and what happens to a spirit as it detaches from a body and moves on to the next incarnation or not. And in the Buddhist concept, unfinished business is basically attachment. All those things that keep you bound up and wound up and messed up about the life that you're living right now. And, the culture we live in really encourages a great deal of attachment, a great deal of emotional entanglement. And what a lot of if you watch the ghost shows, and I don't watch TV, so if you don't, it's okay. But if you are familiar with modern anecdotal ideas of ghosts and hauntings, most people assume that a place is haunted because someone died there. And that person's spirit, the intelligent spirit of the person who had something horrible happen to them for some reason, is stuck in that place. Sometimes that's true, but far more often what's haunting the space is more the impression of it, is the cast off emotional trauma. The intelligent person has moved on. The best example for that would be the field of Gettysburg. I mean, so many people have experiences of what's going on there, and it would be stupid to assume that every single dead soldier that people claim to see fighting this war over and over again all died. Like, all of their ghosts are just condemned to do this over and over again. First of all, what horrible, unfeeling deity would ever do that to anybody? I mean, just be caught in this moment of hell. They couldn't all be that bad. What a lot of hauntings are is emotion, is the intensity of experience, and sometimes the ghosts that haunt places have nothing to do with someone who's died. It's just the rut that we've worn into the space. We notice the negative stuff more than we notice the good stuff because, well, let's frankly think, like, our good emotions can be very fleeting. They're brief, they're brilliant, they're bittersweet because it's very hard to hold on to them. But how hard is it to let go of the heavier stuff? How hard is it to expunge that and achieve the state of non-attachment where you can clear out your unfinished business?
Somebody...
Hi. My name's Jillian. I'm going to try really, really hard to streamline this and give you the cliff notes of it. My dreams are kind of crazy. I work a lot of shit out in my dreams, as I've been told. If there's a person that I know, I'm yelling at them a lot, or who deserves it, like shit that I'm just kind of working out. But most of the time, it's my dogs that have died, and usually they only come to me in my dreams when they have died. And for the most part, lately, the most recent one, who has passed away, her name is Star, she's the one that, it's weird for me to say that I have the most connection with her, because I feel like that's not fair, but I was older.
No judgment here.
Yeah, she was the most recent, but she's the one that's coming to me in the sense where, like, 2 days ago I had a dream where I was, like, I felt her, and I smelled her, and when I woke up, I wasn't sure what, because I've moved a lot, there are a lot of houses where I've had different dogs, and when I woke up, it was so real that I wasn't sure. I was like, oh shit, what house is this? Like, what's happening? I've also had dreams where bad things have happened, and then with very, like, close people, me and my husband have said, like, oh, well, actually that actually came to be, like, bad things that I've dreamed about. So my question is, how do you really know to tell the difference of something that you're just working out and just having an emotional therapy session, I guess, and what is a real conversation that you're having with?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is, having written a book on dream walking, Sigmund Freud saved it for the late end of his career because he didn't want to basically shoot psychology in the foot and psychoanalysis in the foot. But a direct quote is, if we are going to find a proof of the paranormal, it will be in dreams. There is a widespread understanding and even acceptance, especially among the early developers of psychology and psychoanalysis, that there's a great deal of psychic stuff that happens and psychic content that happens in dreams. I'm a big proponent of journaling, of keeping a record. It's very difficult to, like, narrow down the exact mind feel of an experience, but the idea of spirits of the departed visiting you in dreams, there is an old practice in the ancient world, dream incubation. If you've ever heard the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece, the reason he was hot to get his little hands on the Golden Fleece was it was the best sheepskin for doing dream work. That was a part of the way in which you would communicate with the gods in the ancient world, that you would reach out to the spirits of the dead. Some of the ancient graves were popular places to go seek out, lay down, and sleep so that you could speak to the old heroes. And as demigods, as the blessed dead that had transcended the limits of humanity, they in many ways took the what we would consider angels, angelos, messengers. They would be able to carry your requests, your prayers to the gods. They could give you answers. Ziggurats in Sumer and Babylon, what the king would do when seeking any kind of guidance was go up to the top and dream, to have the gods give him a vision. And to go back to the book of Enoch, the dream vision of Enoch all of the prophets of the Old Testament, what they are doing when they prophesy, when they go to speak to God, when they go on their trips to heaven, those are dream visions. And we sort of leave some of that out, we sort of gloss that over, and it's in the Quran as well. When Muhammad goes on his great ride, it is a dream vision. In the ancient world, there was not quite so much focus on dreams as just like this nonsense that plays out in our head. On one hand, your dreams all have something to tell you about you. They're all bubbling up from your subconscious, from your unconscious. Some of them you are doing a very simple task called memory consolidation, where if you are learning a new technique, if you've got a new job and you're learning the cash register, you find yourself dreaming about the same repetitive task. That's your brain taking stuff from short-term memory and storing it in long-term memory. And you just happen, while you're sleeping, to see little bits and pieces of it streaming across. Stress, anxiety, problem solving. The design for the exact shape of the benzene ring came to a fellow in a dream. Eli Whitney developed, basically did the breakthrough on the sewing machine with how to make the needle with the thread on an automatic sewing machine. That came in a dream. And an awful lot of music was developed in dreams, because hypnagogic music is a fairly amazing phenomenon. To tell the difference, journal, record. The best time to write your dreams down is when you just wake up, before you have gotten out of bed, before you take your shower, because everybody's had that moment where you get up, and the minute you have changed your state, changed the position and the very feel around you from where you were dreaming, they occupy this very fragile place in your consciousness, and they just poof as your brain switches gears to waking consciousness.
Right before my eyes are open, or I'll open my eyes and then say like, nope, fuck that.
Yeah, just and try to hold that feel in your head and write as much of it down, analyze them, and over time you will get a sense of like, okay, this is just my brain telling me stories. This is something that is really giving me information. But really, there is no substitute for practice and experience with it.
So basically, just keep doing what I'm doing.
Keep doing it.
Awesome. Thank you.
One more.
Yeah, let's do at least one or two more. And then,
Okay.
So you mentioned Noah's Ark, the deluge,
Yeah.
flood as a result of like the sons of God mingling with the women of earth, and like there is the flood legend in other like ancient religions or societies, Babylon, Sumer, like you mentioned. But then we've had like our own floods that are kind of connected to like wanting to know or produce too much, like Johnstown, Pennsylvania, when the like Pittsburgh industrialists shaved the dam to go fishing and it flooded, or like Katrina when like they didn't build good enough dams. So do you think there's a relationship between like too much fun, too much knowledge or productivity, and then like punishment?
I don't think any deity is that mean, honestly. I think that we make stories up to explain why bad things happen. I think that's one of the functions of myth, is it gives us context, it gives us comfort for things that otherwise have no good explanation. I mean, the Levees fail in New Orleans with Katrina because people were dumb. They didn't think ahead. They didn't think it would happen. And sometimes, well, just bad shit happens. I mean, that's the world we live in. I don't think that there's always as much purpose as stories in retrospect allow there to be, but the purpose of stories is to give us a structure and a framework so that we can find it livable, so that we can do something with how we feel about it.
Yes. This may be a silly question, but I was just wondering, do you believe in parallel universes? So how do they appear like in deja vu situations?
You know, for me, just answering for myself, absolutely is the answer. And I think for me, the way that I approach it, the way I look at it, to me, I'm not a philosopher. I don't do a lot of deep thinking about things that I don't have a practical use for. For me, I'm more of a person who acts in some sort of way. So I always look at things, if it doesn't help me in a practical, everyday way, then a lot of times it just gets stuck on a shelf in the back somewhere. But I think parallel universes are one of those things. I actually think that's what's happening when we do. First off, the word magic. I'm using it here tonight.
It comes with air quotes.
Yes. It's when I use that word, what I'm talking about, it's like a combination of what I do personally is like an amalgamation of, Gnostic Christianity and esoteric Judaism and ancient Chinese Taoist energy circulation exercises, all these things smushed together and stripped of all the dogma and the religious connotations and everything else. That's what I'm referring to as magic. So for me, a lot of it involves certain meditation techniques and energy shifting techniques. So a lot of it in our daily lives, we focus on what we don't want more than we focus on what we want. We don't realize how negative we're being a lot of times. When we're thinking, for example, one of the examples I always use whenever I'm doing the magic classes is, say someone in our neighborhood gets sick. We start thinking, I hope I don't get sick this year. It seems like everybody's getting it. The neighbor's got the flu. Everybody at work's got the flu. I hope I don't get the flu. Next thing you know, you've got it. Because you're holding this image of yourself in your head as sick. Well, you're focusing on, this is just my own personal conclusions now, you're focusing on another dimension where you already are sick. Therefore, you're bringing it more in line with your current reality, which makes it more likely to manifest. So, for me, the way I interact with things like that is I tend to focus on the universe, on the form of reality that I want to experience. So you have to train yourself. It's not something that happens over time, but what you have to train yourself to do is focus on what you want instead of what you don't want. Instead of focusing on fear and being scared that you're going to get sick, practice holding a picture of yourself in your head where you're healthy, where you're happy, where you're whole. And then that's what you're moving in. Energy always moves to wherever we hold our attention at. To me, that's what I think those other places, those scenes that we hold in our head are. They're just other possibilities, other parallel universes. I hate even saying that because it sounds so comic booky.
Tinfoil hatty.
Yeah, but I honestly think that's to some degree what it is. Any reality that you want to experience exists right now. Science tells us now, quantum physics says that everything is happening at one time, the past, the present, and the future. It's all happening right now. It just so happens that we are confining our consciousness to this moment in time, to this individual spot in the time stream. Well, a lot of whenever you're manifesting something, what you're doing is projecting your consciousness a little forward into the future, into what you want it to be. There's a future where you're sick, there's a future where you're not sick, there's a future that falls in between. And what you're doing is feeding that stream of time, that particular universe, to bring it closer into manifestation. You want to add anything to that?
Simply that reality is way more complicated than a finite mind can possibly wrap itself around. There's so much to it. I don't know what the time is, but I want to make sure, since the KGB bar has been wonderful to us and allowed us to have this gathering, let's take a little break. I'll refresh your drinks. Don't forget to tip your bartender. I'm going to get a little bit of something to wet my whistle. And then we will reconvene in, 5-10 minutes once you get yourselves resettled?
Cool.